Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to give it just a minute or so for people to connect, but thank you for joining us this morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our ISPCAN monthly webinar. My name is Jane Estes, and I'm the ISPCAN Knowledge and Content Development Manager. ISPCAN monthly international webinars are always free of charge and cover diverse topics which are presented by subject matter experts from around the globe. These 90-minute webinars are designed to help our members and partners in the ISPCAN community gain access to knowledge and expertise to inform care, improve practice, and drive policy change. All this is critical to help improve the outcomes for children globally. Because we believe that you should have access to all the information and resources available to support you in your work, we encourage you to visit our ISPCAN Knowledge Hub. The ISPCAN Knowledge Hub is an open access centralized library containing ISPCAN and impactful partner resources. This user-friendly hub features our ISPCAN webinars, journal clubs, masterclasses, monthly article insights, data-driven global reports, and shared partner and downloadable resources. If you have an open access resource that you would like to share in our ISPCAN Knowledge Hub, please email me at partnerships@ispcan.org. And we are so excited that you are here with us today. So we wanted to share some tips for making the most of today's session. Just please engage with us. This session is meant to be an active, interactive learning platform. Please participate by sharing your comments in the chat and your questions in the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We will use your questions to begin the Q&A session immediately at the conclusion of the presentation. To enhance your experience, you may enable closed captioning from your Zoom control bar by choosing Captions. And please now take a moment, introduce yourself to other attendees or moderator or feature presenter in the chat box. Let us know where you're joining from and your organization and discipline. And as always, for joining us today, a recording of this session, the panel discussion, presentation slides, and links to all featured resources will be sent to you after the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Holly Malcolm, who's our Membership and Marketing Manager for ISPCAN. And she's going to share some exciting news about our World Day for Child Protection Professionals on July 7th.
Hi, everyone. It's so good that you guys are all here. We're excited to have you here. Again, Jane said, I'm your ISPCAN Membership and Marketing Manager. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have you all here. I just wanted to get on and say hello and remind you that next Sunday, July 7th, we will be celebrating World Day for Child Protection Professionals. This is a day just for you, a day for you to be recognized and honored for all the work you do in protecting our children around the world on a daily basis. You are the true heroes. We are kicking off the week with today's webinar, Practical Strategies for Self-Care. We want this week leading up to next Sunday to be focused on you, on your hard work and dedication. We will send out a link in the chat, and it will lead to the website for this day, and it will give you ideas on how you can celebrate yourselves, how you can celebrate your employees, acknowledge them, and just be reflective of, again, of all the hard work you do. So thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Holly. So now to dive into today's topic, understanding and managing the impact of secondary traumatic stress and burnout among child-serving professionals, practical strategies for self-care. The goal of this webinar is to provide a deeper understanding on the concepts of secondary traumatic stress and burnout, and to address practical strategies on how to improve the well-being of child professionals across a variety of settings. Our key learning objectives for today's session are really to define the spectrum of burnout, secondary traumatic stress, and related terms, to recognize symptoms of secondary traumatic stress and burnout, and explore how the workplace setting can either exacerbate or improve these symptoms, to discuss the impact of secondary trauma on the physiology and well-being of CAN professionals, and child protective systems of care, and to identify practical strategies at an individual and an organizational level to prevent burnout and to promote resiliency. Throughout the webinar, we'll be conducting reflective exercises using the Zoom chat. We really strongly encourage you to participate by sharing your responses in the chat. We'll use your input to inform the discussion around these important topics. And now I'm so excited to have you meet our presenter, Dr. Slatina Kosova. Slatina is a clinical psychologist and director of training at Lifeline for Kids at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Massachusetts Chan Medical School. With the strikingly multidisciplinary and multicultural education obtained in Italy, Switzerland, and the US, Slatina has a strong background in clinical psychology. Her main interests lie in childhood trauma and mindfulness-based interventions. Slatina is an international trainer in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as a qualified teacher for mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. She is also a certified trainer for teaching trauma-informed curricula developed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Slatina is actively collaborating and presenting at an international level. She's a go-to expert in implementing evidence-based treatments for children and youth in several countries, including war-torn zones such as Ukraine. And now it's my honor to turn the session over to Slatina.
Thank you so much, Jane. Good morning, afternoon, evening to everybody here in whatever part of the world you're joining us. Before sharing my slides, I just wanted to say a warm welcome to really everyone. It's so exciting to see people from Kenya and Tanzania and India and Scotland and East Europe. It is absolutely an honor to be partnering with ISKCON, but also to open up this amazing week that is celebrating you as professionals in the field of child protection services and any work that you are doing with children. So for me, it is an absolute honor to be here. And I just wanted to also say I'm actually Bulgarian as a citizen. I lived in Italy, Switzerland. I'm currently in the United States working at the UMass Chan Medical School. So I consider myself a very international citizen of the world. And this is why when I do interventions and presentations like this that are really at a global level and where I have the opportunity to have so many people from around the world, it's incredibly exciting and meaningful to me. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for all the work that you're doing every day, because you are the people right there who are doing everything that you do in every day of your work in your life. So thank you for being here. And for this reason, with ISKCON, we really meant to make you a gift today. I know that we usually attend webinars and professional trainings to improve as professionals and work better with the children and families that we're serving. But today I'm really hoping that we can take an hour and a half for you to reflect about you, to reflect about the work that you are doing, and to recognize the important impact that this work can have on your psychological and physical health. And most importantly, I hope that we can take a little bit of a reflection and pause to think, what are the things that you can do? What are the things that your organization can do to help you deal with potential signs and symptoms of burnout or secondary traumatic stress, or even to prevent that those things can happen? So with this, I will share my slides and start my presentation. So again, we'll be talking about understanding and managing the impact of secondary traumatic stress and burnout. We'll be talking about self-care strategies. And as you are probably already noticing, I am a very relational type of presenter. And again, this particular webinar, it's incredibly meaningful to me and to all the partners from EastCan. And so please feel free to interact with us as much as you can. I know that you are limited in the way that you can interact, but there is a whole chat that you can use. And I consider myself someone who loves to learn and exchange experiences and knowledge. So I will be talking about a lot of concepts today, but you are the experts of your work and you are the experts of yourself. So really feel free to ask questions. Jane and Holly will be monitoring the chat in case I miss something, and they will make sure that we will answer. But I'll be really happy if we can make this as a dialogue. And of course, we will also leave some time for questions at the end. So our agenda is really ambitious. The first part of this presentation, I would love to dedicate it more around just the definition of secondary traumatic stress, of burnout, of all the related terms that might resonate with you. And I think that this is important just so that we are aware that some of the things that we might be experiencing as professionals taking care of children with trauma or mental health conditions or living in stressful situations can be actually normal reactions, but indicators of potential burnout or secondary traumatic stress. And the second part of the training, I would love to dedicate it around practical strategies. What can we do as individuals, but what can also our organizations do? I'm sure that a lot of you here are in positions of leadership. And so I hope that you can take some of the ideas and bring them back to your team. And in terms of learning objectives, as Jane already mentioned briefly, I hope that you will be able to identify what are some of the main signs and symptoms of burnout and secondary traumatic stress. What is the physiology behind, right? So we talk a lot about burnout and secondary traumatic stress, but we don't talk a lot about what is actually happening in our bodies. And so before talking about what can we do, I think it's important to understand what is really happening inside of us so that we then know what particular strategies can work for us. I'll also tell you a new response to stress, that it's something that we don't talk very often, but that it's really important. And then hopefully you will be able to identify some strategies for your own management of your own well-being. Now, I know, and I want to start off by acknowledging that the word self-care, sometimes when we say to people, oh, you have to go and, take care of yourself. And people get really annoyed sometimes, which is normal, right? Because they may feel like, okay, now you'll tell me to go do this mindfulness exercise or do more yoga or whatever. And this is again, one more thing on my endless list of the day. So I really want to acknowledge this fact. And also to say that I really I've recently heard this kind of definition of self-care that really resonated with me, which is that true self-care is not salt baths or chocolate cakes, right? Or all these nice things, but it is about making the choice to build a life that you don't need to escape from. And so today, again, I'm hoping that we can take this time as our own reflection about how can we bring maybe more balance between our personal life and professional life. What are the things that we are missing in our own sense of self, of nourishment, and how can we access those activities, those people, those parts within ourselves that can give us a little bit more of a breath and a little bit more of a balance, so that we don't feel like we have to escape from our own lives. Now, why do we have to spend our Monday morning, afternoon, or evening thinking about secondary traumatic stress and burnout first, which will be the first part of our training? Well, probably I don't have to convince you a lot because we see the incredible number that's enrolled into this webinar. But when we look at the different professionals working in the field of child protection, and these are all people that are here today, and when we look at social workers, for example, we see that around 70% of social workers experience at least one symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, and more than half of them meet the criteria for a full symptoms cluster, right? So you may feel like you're hyper aroused most of the time, or more irritable, or having sleeping problems. When we look at psychotherapists, I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I enter this category. Between 20 and 40% of us as therapists suffer burnout because of the complexities of patients that we take care of. And when we look at trauma psychotherapists, that number goes even higher. And we also know, unfortunately, that at least half of the US physicians, and I believe that this is true for all the physicians around the world, suffer burnout. And we also know that 1 in 15 physicians during the COVID pandemic reported suicidal thoughts, which I think it's really a lot for the people who are actually taking care of us. So the numbers are really high, they're really alarming, and we're starting to see these more and more. Now, you're probably wondering, okay, what are the predictors of burnout, right? What are the things that can make me more vulnerable to burnout? They're multiple. We categorize them in 3 main categories. Of course, work settings. It doesn't have to be number 1, but it is a very important piece. There is mixed research. Some research is showing that people who work in independent settings, like private practices, for example, suffer less burnout compared to, for example, hospital settings. Still, the results are mixed about outpatient versus inpatient. We know that inpatient can be exposing you more to direct type of traumatic events. However, outpatient settings could be also stressful for different types of reasons, but definitely the job demand and high workload and caseload and lack of support are factors that can make us more vulnerable. And then clients factors, of course, the people that we take care of, right? If you are managing more patients who have suicidal behaviors or are at risk of suicide, kids, families with more complexity, or people with substance use disorder or difficult personality traits or grief, right? The more complex our patients are, the more burnout we might be exposed to. And then we get into our own personal factors that can contribute to secondary traumatic stress and burnout. And here it gets interesting, at least for me. There are different personal factors that we want to pay attention. Mental health and trauma history. I know that if we as clinicians, for example, or professionals have our own history of trauma or mental health, that can make us more relatable to our patients because we can understand exactly what they're going through. And at the same time, having your own trauma history can make you feel more easily triggered, right? Can make this work more difficult. And we had chosen a case scenario that we'll share with you later that gives those examples. Psychological distress. We know how hard it is to have personal things going on in your personal life, dealing with losses or any other stressors, and then having to show up for work, right? So this is definitely a factor. Sense of competence. We are seeing in research that those professionals who has a better sense of competency, better sense of, I know how to deal with problems or with work, right? Those people who have that mindset and skills, they suffer less burnout. The coping styles, professionals who are more outgoing, more likely to ask for help, to access their social support systems, are less likely to suffer burnout. Interestingly, about race, white professionals may suffer more burnout. That doesn't mean that other professionals don't suffer burnout, but when we look at Black or Hispanics, they may be more easily accessing their social support systems and asking for help compared to their professional peers, to their white peers. Age, here again, the results are mixed. Some studies are showing that definitely the older that we get, there is the more cumulative effect on the clients that we're serving. Particularly, one research was showing that for psychologists with more than 12 years of experience, the levels of burnout can be really much higher. However, we also know that young professionals, those of you who are just starting in this field, you may feel more like you don't have the exact skills and competency to deal with this complex type of field and clients. And so that can be more difficult. Educational level, the more we are educated, the more likely we are to suffer burnout because we serve more complex type of clients. And then good news for parents like me, kids are helpful actually because they do buffer the stress that we have in our lives, right? And in other cases, for people who don't have kids, maybe your partner, right? Your own family relationships are really important, and we will see exactly why later. Now, you're probably now wondering, okay, tell me what are other protective factors, right? How can we focus more on the protective factors? Because we definitely don't want to stay and talk just about the negative pieces, but we want to look at what are some of the resiliency, the factors that we can build in our lives so that we are more resistant against burnout or have more balance in our lives. As we just mentioned, personal factors, right? Having the family support. There was a lot of research, and from my own experience, really coming back home and being able to share your work or your day with your partner. That doesn't mean that our partners know what to do or they will give us a solution, but knowing that there is someone there for you who can listen, who can be there for you is incredible. And the second personal factor is that those people who have plans for self-care, those people who are committed and making sure that they dedicate part of their days into their own self-care, whatever it looks like, are less likely to develop burnout. And then some professional factors. One of the things that we really want to convey here today is that it is not just about you. It is not you the only one responsible to deal with burnout and secondary traumatic stress, but it's very much at organizational level. And so those professionals who know that they're working in an organization that really takes care of them, right? One of the quotes from one research was just knowing that your supervisor or management knew that that work had impact on us was huge. And I think that being part of ISPCAN, being members of ISPCAN that really takes care of that piece as well can be an important outlet. Organizational strategies, definitely professional mastery. We will see why the sense of mastery, the sense of trainings, opportunities to learn can really increase your sense of competency and lower down the burnout. And then the high job satisfaction, right? Those moments that are really showing us why we even chose to be the professionals that we are. Peer support. Fundamentals are your colleagues, your supervisors, again, people with whom you can process your experiences. And humor was one of the strategies that was really showing to be really helpful for people working in different organizations. And we also know that burnout and secondary traumatic stress can have profound consequences, not only on your professional life in terms of decreasing the quality of care that you're providing and the satisfaction of your patients and the turnover of professionals, but it can also impact your personal life, right? We know that us being stressed at work and feeling burnout can really impact our sense of self, our relationships. It can get us doing more things that might be more harmful for us. And then we can also develop some signs of depression or anxiety, and we will see exactly how those look like. Okay, now I will proceed here and talk a little bit about what is actually secondary traumatic stress, what is burnout, what are some of the related terms so that we can have a better understanding about what those are. Now, when we talk about secondary traumatic stress is really that sense of emotional distress that comes from both direct experience, you're witnessing something traumatic of your clients, or indirect experience, right? So when we are reading, for example, the notes or reports or any case presentations of clients, when we are hearing from our clients their histories. I am an international trainer of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and part of the therapy is to ask the child to give us a narration, to tell us everything about the most difficult things and traumas that happened in their lives. And that can be really impactful for us as professionals. And secondary traumatic stress, of course, it can go from mild to severe. And of course, it is normal for you to hear a horrible story of a child and then go back home and not being able to sleep that night. But secondary traumatic stress, if we really don't pay attention to it, it can actually turn into symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. When we talk about burnout, burnout is actually very similar to secondary traumatic stress. And there is if you have some time to research the history of burnout, it actually started from a psychoanalyst who escaped he was a Holocaust survivor. And he was a psychoanalyst in New York City. He was doing 2 jobs, night and day. And then at some point, he really couldn't move out of his bed. And he started basically psychoanalyzing himself and recording himself. And he was the one who actually discovered that burnout is a condition, is something that can happen to professionals. And it's characterized by this sense of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, almost as you are not there, you're not present, reduced feelings of personal accomplishment. You may feel like you are doing something, but it really doesn't reach the cause that you are hoping for or reaching for. And when one therapist, after 30 years of private practice, when he closed or she closed the practice, and when they were asked why, they just said, well, I just began to stop caring about my clients, right? And this is a big, big factor and red flag. And what we want today is to maybe prevent us getting to that point. Any comments or questions so far? I don't want to lose anything in the chat. Please feel free to ask any questions. You can definitely have access to the references and research. I see those questions in the chat, so you will have those slides for sure. Okay. Now, secondary traumatic stress and burnout are not the only conditions, are not the only terms, but there are actually a lot of related terms. And I think that it's worth it to quickly go around this little circle and think about those terms. And I'll be very curious at the end, we'll have a little reflective exercise. So I will actually pause, and I would love to hear if you resonate with some of those, or what are your thoughts about these terms. So direct exposure. Direct exposure is that situation in which, for those of you who are working, for example, let's say in hospital settings, inpatient settings, residential settings, or sometimes could be also in an outpatient setting, in a private practice. But if you are witnessing directly some traumatic situation, for example, I have a colleague who had worked for many years in an inpatient psychiatric hospital, and he was telling me how he witnessed a child who was trying to kill themselves by jumping from a wall, right? So something like this can be really traumatizing, or any other direct exposure. Vicarious traumatization is another term that is basically that impact at a deeper level in us professionals, in the way that we think about ourselves, about the world, about the others. And it can really impact our sense of trust, of safety, of control. And this is, for example, when you are treating children, you are seeing all the abuse, all the maltreatment, and you start really doubting caregivers. You start really doubting institutions like daycare center. Maybe you develop of anxiety about your own child, right? So this is a vicarious traumatization. It is the impact in the way that we're really thinking and seeing things around us. Compassion fatigue, probably you can all relate to that. And this is basically this sense of emotional and physical exhaustion and reduced capacity of being empathic. And compassion fatigue kind of evoked a little bit of discussions in the literature of how can I be fatigued by my own compassion. But it could, right? If we don't have our own boundaries, if we don't have our own space, being constantly on into listening and helping and relating patients can bring us into being more desensitized in a way, right? As our own protective mechanism. Moral distress. I believe that probably each of us had faced moral distress in some capacity. And this is the type of stress that occurs when we know what is the best thing to do for our clients, but because of an organizational or system-related type of restrictions or policies or rules, we can't really do this. And again, this can also bring a lot of stress. And I believe that it's a pretty common situation. Now, it's not all bad, but I really want to focus your attention on something that we call compassion satisfaction. And you will see later why compassion satisfaction can be an important buffer against burnout. And compassion satisfaction are those positive aspects of our work, right? Those shining moments when you see that you're really making a difference for your clients, for your colleagues, for the people that matter to you in your work. This is when you are seeing a child or a family healing and making progresses, or when you receive that email from someone else thanking you about the incredible help that you provided, right? So those are the moments that we need to hold on to because they will give us that positive injection and buffer against the burnout. And here I would like to take a little bit of a break, not break in terms of a real break, but just a reflective type of moment and pause. And I would like to see in the chat, what do people think about all these terms or everything that we talked about it? Is there anything that comes to your mind or...
There was a question, Zatina, about the difference between PTSD and compassion fatigue.
That is a very interesting question. Thank you. I think that compassion fatigue, and this is my own way of understanding it, it is more about that sense of desensitization, almost like lack of our capacity to be empathetic towards someone, right? We know that we can really feel for people when they're in pain, but there might be a point that we feel a little bit more absent, a little bit less likely to engage and to profoundly feel that sense of empathy and compassion. That doesn't mean that we're not empathetic, but again, it means that it's time to think about ourselves. PTSD is more a condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, that incorporates three more factors, actually. And there are four particular type of symptoms cluster, right? So the first one is intrusive symptoms. This is when you are constantly thinking about what happened, you have intrusive thoughts, images, flashbacks. Then we have hyperarousal, right? Our alarm system is hyperaroused. We're on alert. We're expecting something bad to happen. We may not be able to sleep. And then we have dissociation or avoidance, right? We want to really avoid seeing those clients. We want to avoid thinking about negative things. And then we have a negative alteration in our thoughts and in our feelings, right? So PTSD is more of a sort of like incorporating a little bit more of symptoms.
Thank you. And if everyone would like to share in the chat some of the reflective answers to these questions, Zatina, I'm not sure if you can see Kelly's, but she said, I appreciate you mentioning moral distress. It's a common experience. However, I don't recall ever having heard it specifically mentioned in a training like this before.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelly, for mentioning this. Actually, a lot of people, when we present on moral distress, they're like, yes, I really know what you mean. And it's great because I never had the word, I never had the framework about it. So absolutely.
And Aisha said it does relate to me. With my internship in the clinical and psychiatric fields, I felt this enough to overwhelm me. I've not felt like these fields are not just for me. I felt like these fields are not just for me. Thank you for sharing that, Aisha. I'm sure it's a common sentiment.
Absolutely, yeah. And Aisha and everyone, I think that we all have this feeling, particularly during our educational period, that we feel like, I don't know if I can really do this. I don't know if this is really for me. And I would say to not get discouraged because it is hard, but I think that with the appropriate support system and really time for yourself, it's definitely can be manageable. But thank you for being vulnerable and putting out there something that many people think, I'm sure.
And Francine said that thank you for explaining moral distress. I think that's hitting home with a lot of people, said Tina. She said she does experience that more than other types.
Yes.
And it says a comment, burnout is very dangerous, but how can we be free of its impact? Which hopefully you'll share with us shortly. And then LaToya asked, can compassion fatigue be a coping strategy?
Compassion fatigue can be a coping strategy. Yes, yes, absolutely. I think it is. I think most of these symptoms are protective mechanisms that are telling us, hey, you need to really pay attention to me as body, as mind, right, as emotions. And so definitely it is, and we will see exactly why. I was also reading, Jane, what Gabriella Lozano wrote about this is a incredible description of a direct type of trauma, of a kiddo accidentally swallowing something. So thank you again for sharing all these real life experiences. And this is exactly what we're talking about.
And I think a question that came up is, the distress as a child protection professional when the clients you serve don't pursue the desired course of action.
Yes, you're saying, Jane, when your client don't really follow what you were, yes, definitely, absolutely. And thank you for bringing this up, because again, secondary traumatic stress and burnout doesn't have to be related to some big things that are happening, but it could be just, again, maybe clients not following through or having more complexities that are accumulated.
And there's comments again about the profession attracting people who have their own trauma in their backgrounds, right? Trying to take their own trauma into a positive way. Many enter into, some of these child-centered professions, and, how that again affects their level of trauma.
Yeah. And I saw someone saying and mentioning post-traumatic growth. And I think that this is related to what you, Jane, are saying about how can we turn our own experiences, right, and our own difficulties and challenges actually into a process of growth and actually into a higher compassion satisfaction. And I would love to cite one of the works that we have been doing in Ukraine, and the incredible results that we're seeing there.
Thank you all for your comments. I really appreciate you. And Satina, I think you can see these as well.
Yes, I love how people are really related to everything that we're talking about. Rini, I like having a healthy detachment is very important. When I started working part-time, I feel better and healthier. Yes. And I would love for people during the second half, if you can share actually your own ways of this healthy detachment or healthy boundaries, because this is a common question. How can I keep my boundaries well from my work and home? So please feel free to share all your wisdom. Tina, I see a question about age and gender. I think there was a slide before with some of those personal factors. The results are still mixed, and I'm happy to send more, any type of research articles that people are interested. There was one study saying that women are more likely to suffer burnout and secondary traumatic stress. I don't know if there is a robust research behind that. And about age, we know that there are a lot of mixed sort of results. Vanessa, yes, you will have the recording, I believe, on the website that Jane created. And you will have, by the way, Jane did a wonderful job creating a whole page with all the resources, and she'll be also putting a lot of the resources in the chat. So thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, let's get a little bit more into the signs and symptoms of burnout and secondary traumatic stress. I really want to acknowledge that here, every one of us, we can have our own very personal ways of expressing stress. These are just some common signs and symptoms for you to pay attention. Definitely a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, right? That sense of I will never make a difference for these people, or people will never get better, things will never get better, maybe that's not for me. Inability to embrace complexity. We know that when we're stressed, when our nervous system is stressed, when we are out of our own window of tolerance, which is a concept that we will talk about later, it is much more difficult to sort of be flexible and embrace challenges that maybe our supervisor or manager is giving us. Inability to listen, avoidance, right? Sometimes we want to avoid specific clients. We don't feel like even going to work, or we may get more angry and cynical about the work that we're doing. Definitely sleep, for me at least, sleep is a big indicator when I feel stressed out. So problems of sleeping, difficulty sleeping, or feeling the need to sleep too much, almost as a way to escape. The chronic exhaustion, the physical part, or other people might go on the other direction of minimizing, right? So when you have someone who had actually witnessed a lot of difficult and traumatizing things, but then they're saying, well, it's not a big deal, it's fine, it's okay. That's also something to think about. Sense of guilt. I should have done more. I made a mistake. It's my fault, right? And particularly for those of you who have been dealing with losses of clients, this is a whole different chapter, but that sense of guilt, it's really important to think about because, again, when we deal with losses, it can get really complicated. Preoccupation with client stories, and then all the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder that I already shared earlier, of the intrusive thoughts, of feelings more isolated, estranged, or feeling even trapped and infected by trauma, right? Feeling like nobody can really understand me. Nobody can really get it, what I'm going through. And you almost feel like you're living this double life of holding all this burden and thoughts and feelings inside of you, but then having to put a face or present yourself in a different way to life and people because they may not be able to understand. And so again, secondary traumatic stress can really parallel symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, which at this point we already repeated several times. Now, in the same way as if you go to a doctor, right, the doctor will not just prescribe you medication before running some labs, some tests, asking you some questions. In the same way, we don't want to jump into the practical strategies and tell you what to do before really understanding what is happening in our bodies when we are under stress. And as you all know, right, when we are experiencing trauma or stress, there are three main ways that we usually react. And those are fight, flight, and freeze, right? The same parts of the brain that get activated with trauma can get activated with stress, right? It's the same sort of networks. But, and by this point, you'll be like, okay, Zlatina, I know all these things. You're not telling me anything new, but I will tell you something new. And the new piece is that actually, from an evolutionary perspective, we had realized that the fight, flight, and freeze response doesn't really work well when we're stressed or when we're traumatized. Why? Because we're big human beings. If I try to freeze, you will still be able to see me because I am loud, I am big. If I have to escape a tiger, if I have to run away from a tiger, it might be really difficult because I just don't have that body of this animal, right? What we realized as human beings as a response to be the most effective response to stress and trauma is the affiliate response. And only we as human beings, our species, can do this. Only we, in a situation of threat, in a situation of stress, can actually relate to others and turn around and identify who are the safe people around me who can help me to escape that lion, right? Who can help me to deal with my stress. However, if you are a physician, a professional going through COVID, maybe when you couldn't even see people in person, or if you are so overwhelmed with your caseload and workload that you don't really even have the time to look around and relate to other people, right? If your own supervisor and manager and organization are burnout and they don't really even have the time to provide you with the time, that part of our brain that it's about the affiliate response, which is our ability to reach to other people and ask for help, gets hijacked. And what happens is that we get back into our survival mode, which is the fight, flight, and freeze, right? And in that way, when we are constantly under stress, there is a chronic activation, right, of specific responses, meaning that the cardiovascular system gets activated, your immune system is always on, your digestion is paused because I really don't have time for anything but just to deal with my work and my stress right now. And the vagal nerve, which is the nerve that allows us to relax and to rest, is on break because I don't have time to sleep. I don't have the time to let my guard on. And this is why our body and our brain gets into this constant fight, flight, and freeze. And our ability to access our support system, our ability to relate, to connect to other people, to seek other people gets really hijacked, right? And so I think that from a physiological perspective, this is really important. And one of the most important things that we'll be talking in terms of practical strategies is how can we activate that affiliate response, right? How can we allow ourselves to get back to our support systems and who are the people in our life who can help us? Now, moving into the strategies of our time together, I really want to acknowledge that burnout and secondary traumatic stress is not an individual type of problem, right? But it's also an organizational. And if we only place attention on coping strategies at an individual level, right, that would mean that we're implying that individuals experiencing secondary traumatic stress are at fault. But it really requires both an individual effort and a systemic approach, a cultural shift in order to be able to build that sense of resiliency. Today, we'll be focusing more on an individual level because those are the practical strategies that you can immediately implement, but we'll be also talking about the organizational level. And I hope that those of you who are representing their own organizations, you can think and reflect, how can you take some of this knowledge for your own team? Now, I would like to meet Tony, and this is just a case that we selected that we may be reflecting on. And I will read you a little bit of information about Tony. There are 3 slides here, and then we'll take just a minute of seeing what we think. So Tony is a 32-year-old woman who identifies as African American and who works at a child welfare agency in the county where she lives. She was recently promoted from frontline worker to supervisor with little training on how to supervise but with no training on secondary traumatic stress. Tony's supervisees all have high caseloads, requiring both them and her to work long hours. She feels distressed about the disproportionately high numbers of African American youth she sees placed in foster care and sees many of these youth remain in care for long periods of time. Tony is one of the few African American people working at her agency, and she often feels pulled to provide extra consultation to coworkers who have African American families on their caseload and who have no training or shown skills related to cultural competency. In spite of spending her time trying to provide that extra consultation, Tony continues to experience frequent racial microaggressions by her white colleagues and supervisees. For example, Tony has overheard her supervisees complain about how argumentative and aggressive the African American families on their caseloads are and make sweeping statements about all African American people. Many of her supervisees are young and white and don't seem to recognize their white privilege or the ongoing institutional racism in their country. In terms of personal history, we know that Tony's family and friends express mistrust for child welfare and disapproval for her work. Tony was in the child welfare system when she was a child. She was removed from her biological mother due to substance use disorder. She was placed in several foster homes between ages 2 and 6, and then she was adopted. Occasionally, she had mild depressive episodes, and lately she started drinking more at night after work. What her manager noticed. Tony's manager has noticed that Tony has become more avoidant in the office and seems exhausted all of the time. But when he asked about it, she has brushed it off and said that she's just busy. Tony's actually hesitant to talk with her manager or other coworkers about what she's experiencing because she does not want to be perceived as difficult to work with or overly sensitive. What do people think about Tony? Is this a case that you can totally see, or you have been Tony? What are some risk factors that you're seeing here? Any thoughts and feelings about Tony real quick before we continue? Past history of trauma, lack of support, yes. Definitely her own background. Absolutely. Unsupportive community, systemic racism, lack of training, yes. Vulnerability from childhood history, lack of training. Stress from being new at a job, downplaying the effect on her, yes. Specific pressures on her performance. Absolutely. I think that you are all absolutely understanding the situation of Tony. And I want to remind you that exactly everything that you just said are the risk factors that can place us into a major risk of burnout and secondary traumatic stress. And those are the work factors, clients factors, and personal factors. And Tony sort of clicks all these boxes, right? She has no training, victim of microaggression, high caseload, but also working with complex cases that are reminding her about her own childhood trauma. So let's see again, what can Tony do and what her organization can do, and get again into the depth of the practical strategies in the next 20-25 minutes. So there are 3 factors that I would like to discuss with you about dealing with secondary traumatic stress and burnout. And those are the sense of self-awareness, right? How can we know when we're stressed? How can we know what we need? Sense of regulation and sense of connectedness. And so I will talk about practical ways to address these 3 factors that build our sense of resiliency. And I would love to hear from you. So feel free to share things in the chat as we will be going through these strategies. Self-awareness. As you probably have seen from my initial presentation, I am also a teacher of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I would love to come back and give another webinar on mindfulness, actually. This will be a future project. And this has been personally something that had helped me a lot in my own life. And I think that mindfulness, more than just relaxation or regulation, is also a way to build self-awareness. And a lot of research is showing that when we live our lives on autopilot, right, our levels of stress are much higher. But if we are able to be self-aware, which means even now, I would invite you to just take a moment and be aware of your bodies, be aware of your breathing, aware of the thoughts running through your mind, aware now of your surroundings, any noises that you're hearing, any smells, right? So just taking that simple moment of being aware of what is happening inside of you and outside of you. And this is the first step when we want to deal with our stress, right? Now, the way that we want to foster the sense of self-awareness is, again, building the awareness of our internal responses, what our thoughts, feelings, and body sensations. But also, how can we be more aware of our triggers? Are there particular clients that are stressful for me? Are there particular situations at work that are really triggering, right? If I am Tony working with specific clientele, children in foster care, right? That could be really stressful for me. So what can I do in my organization to deal with that? A great concept and framework about stress and trauma, something that you can also use with your clients, is the window of tolerance. And probably a lot of you are already familiar with this theory, but it basically says that we all have our window of tolerance. And this is when we wake up and we are in our best selves and energy to deal with the day. For me, this is when I got enough sleep, I ate well, things in my personal life are okay, right? When we're stressed, our levels of tolerance and our window of tolerance is much smaller, and we are much more likely to get easily go into the hyperarousal type of mode. This is when we're more in the volcanic mode, out of control, anxious, angry, or some of us may go into a hypoarousal mode. This is when we are more withdrawn, isolated. And so the first step when we think about how can we regulate ourselves is to be aware of what are our signs and symptoms, right? How do I look under stress? Am I more likely to get irritable, reactive, impulsive? Do I feel things in my body that are showing me that I am getting into that middle zone? Or I'm more likely to withdraw, to shut down, to isolate, maybe like Tony, who started using more alcohol, or she didn't really want to speak to her supervisor because she was hesitant to put herself out there. And so if your signs and symptoms are most likely to be in the volcano type of space, then we need down regulation, right? If I'm more irritable, more reactive, maybe I need 5 minutes to go and take a couple of deep breaths, listen to my favorite calming music, right? Do something that can down regulate me. But if I'm someone who is in my iceberg mode, right? Maybe I need something that can activate me, something that can upregulate me, maybe exercise, behavioral regulation, talking to someone, right? So again, the first step is to understand where we are, what are our symptoms under stress, and what we need. And these are just some examples of stressors. I'm sure that you can give a lot of examples, and feel free if anyone would like to share something in the chat that it's particularly stressful for you. I see people asking about rumination. This is a great question about rumination, which is definitely also one of my signs and symptoms when I get stressed out. I think there are different ways how to target rumination. Again, I think some of the regulation activities that we will show later can answer this question. I think that practicing mindfulness and self-awareness can help us to get aware of the moment that we are getting caught up into the rumination and allow us to come back. Another great resource, Brian Miller, which is part of your resources at the end, but this is a framework that actually tells you, to be fully present with your thoughts, with your emotions, and even engage during your sessions with your clients so that you are just more aware. Too many bosses to answer to. We have how microaggressions from coworkers can be effectively addressed. This is a big question, and I would love to hear what other people think about microaggressions. And I think self-advocacy here, it's really important to think about. How can you advocate to yourself in a way that is wise, in a way that feels comfortable? And who are your affiliates, right? Who are the people who can understand and address that issue of microaggression?
I like how Jane appreciated the volcano iceberg analogy, and, she speaks to how that shows why some strategies work for some individuals, don't work for others, with the up and down regulations. So I thought that was a great point of what you covered.
Yeah. There is a great question about implicit bias, and Jane and everyone here helped me to sort of talk about this. But implicit bias is essentially when implicitly we might be biased because of someone's race, because of someone's way of talking, someone's professional role, right? And sometimes unintentionally, we can say something that may have a different impact on that person. And this is why we have to always think, what is the intention of what I want to say versus the impact on that person? There is also a great test from Harvard University about implicit bias that I will be happy to share after the webinar. We didn't put it here, but it's a great question. Debriefing sessions that are not well run are more exacerbating. Yes, Asha, I agree with you. And working in a reactive environment rather than a proactive one. So definitely a lot of you are talking about organizational type of stressors. And I think, again, the teamwork here and the responsibility and the connection that you will have with those supervisors and managers can be really important. And we'll talk more about this. Another way to practice self-awareness is through questionnaires and some measures. And the best one that we know out there, or one of the best one, is called the ProQual, which is the Professional Quality of Life. I know that Jane put this in the chat for those of you who would like to take this test. This is not a diagnostic tool or anything like this, but it is a great questionnaire that it's allowing you to score your secondary traumatic stress with specific questions, your levels of burnout, and your levels of compassion satisfaction. It is very easy to use. And again, it simply gives you sort of a range of where you are. So you're more than welcome to take some time and take the test. At an organizational level, there are also amazing questionnaires. This is a link from the University of Kentucky, actually has a great center for childhood trauma as well. And they had done an amazing job in developing measures. I'm sure that Jane is putting all these resources in the chat as well. But this particular assessment is for those of you who are more in a leadership role, and you can take it for your full organization. Those are two great websites that you can have a lot of information on secondary traumatic stress and burnout, and you can find all these assessments. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, NCTSN, also has incredible tip sheets and a lot of resources that you can read, but also share with colleagues and use for your professional organization. Many other assessment measures that are sort of putting together more aspects of ourselves are also available. And for those of you who prefer apps, this is a great provider resilience app that you can download. and it incorporates the professional quality of life. It can send you some reminders. Again, it's just a graphic, nice way to give you that help with the self-awareness. Once we are aware of our stress, we also want to know how to regulate our emotions, our behaviors, right, our reactions. And I would start by saying that we really have to start from the basics. I know that it may sound sort of repetitive or kind of intuitive enough, but if we don't have enough sleep, right, if we barely have the time to eat, it will be very difficult for us to engage in a place of self-exploration or even mindfulness, right? And so we really want to make sure that our basic needs are met. And when we talk about regulation, we talk about top-down and bottom-up strategies. So top-down strategies are the cognitive strategies, right? We start from a cognitive level. Let me think about my thoughts. Let me become aware of my thoughts. Let me analyze my thoughts and maybe change them, right? And see that that rumination maybe is not based on any facts, for example. Bottom-up strategies are those that are starting from the bodies, right? And in most cases, when we are really stressed out and when we are in our survival mode of fight, flight, and freeze, the part of the brain, the amygdala, is the one that it's most likely activated, right? And so we want, in these cases, to start from the body. We want to start with maybe breathing. We want to start with mindfulness. We want to start with something that can calm our nervous system and then engage into the processing of our thoughts. I already spoke about mindfulness, but there is a lot of research showing that mindfulness can actually calm down the amygdala and give you access to your prefrontal lobes and executive functioning, right? There are a lot of resources out there. This is the 3 minutes breathing space from the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is a very easy way to sort of check in with yourself. What is your experience? Focus on your breathing, focus on your body. The body scan meditation is another example of just scanning your body and being aware of different parts of your body. And there are a lot of free meditation resources out there. One of them will be shared with you, but there are many more. And then there are a bunch of applications. I personally am a big fan of the 10% Happier, which is the higher little red circle that you are seeing. I'm not sure if it's free right now. It was free during COVID, but it is an incredible app. And then Calm or Mindfulness or Headspace, there are a lot more out there. And we also put those additional ones for mental health that can be helpful for you. And again, all these will be accessible through the slides. Other activities developed by NCTSN and other networks are some funny ones, like the WTF protocol that you're seeing, which is not what you're thinking, but sometimes we just need to walk, right, to talk it through with someone, and then make sure we hydrate and flush it out, right? This is another resource that shows you if you have 2 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes at work, what can you do? And again, I think this is just showing that we don't have to sit and meditate for 45 minutes, but even if we have 2 minutes, we can really catch where we are and do something to sort of regulate. When I was practicing more mindfulness at work, I was offering, for example, to my peers to join me in my office, and we will have just 5 minutes mindfulness meditations almost every day, which was a way to connect with my colleagues and also to sort of bring that sense of awareness and regulation. I want to check the chat. Thank you, Jane, for putting all these resources. You're great. I see the polyvagal theory here. And if anyone would like to share anything that works for you, I would love to hear more about it.
I hope you can see all the reactions going across the screens, Latina. It's been hearts and clapping, and it's just, there's so many positives. I don't know if you can see those when you're presenting, but it's been lovely.
I actually want to thank people for doing that because it's so nice to go through my slides and see these little hearts and clapping hands. Thank you so much. Reading stories with happy endings, reading, dancing. Thank you, Jane, for all the education. Definitely having someone like Jane, it's a great way to deal with burnout and any type of stress. Neurographic art, connectedness. Yes, yes. Neurographic art, this is very interesting. Cooking.
I saw dancing. I saw humor, which was fun.
Yes. Sports, trauma sensitive yoga, regular and consistent prayer. Absolutely. Tapping into our own belief system can be really powerful. Crying in the bathroom. Thank you so much for being real and sharing things.
Crying in the bathroom. I have done that. So thank you for sharing.
Yes, I believe many of us have done this. Puzzles, watching movies, shopping, hug my dog. Yes, I also have a service dog actually, and dogs can be so therapeutic. Withdraw and center myself. Thank you so much, everyone, for these incredible ideas. I wish there was a way to save the chat and sort of inspire ourselves. Having your own party, play some music, sharing exercises. That's great. And just because of a question of time, I wish we had 5 more hours together, but I will keep going so that we have even a broader overview of some other strategies. One of my favorite things, actually, again, it's coming from mindfulness, so maybe that's my implicit bias to answer those of you who are asking about implicit bias. But one of the wiser things that I've heard is that basically this citation saying, every thought is a mental event that contains a seed of reality surrounded by a shell of inference, right? And I think that the way that I understand this is that in many cases, in most of the cases, the way that we think of something or our automatic thoughts can be just some sort of interpretation, right, of a reality that may not be really a fact. And something else that mindfulness says is that not our thoughts are not facts, even though sometimes it feels like they are. And so for those of you who are dealing with rumination, I think this is a great way to start and think about, right? To not really take so seriously all of our thoughts, right? Especially when we're stressed, especially when we're in a dark place. The basics of the cognitive behavioral therapy, for those of you who are familiar with this, is the cognitive triangle. And the basic idea here is that every type of situation that we are in can evoke certain thoughts. These thoughts can impact the way that we feel, and the way that we feel can impact what we do, right? Our behaviors. So, for example, if you're seeing 2 friends talking between them and not saying hi, let's say you're walking to a party, you see 2 friends, you say hi, they don't say hi back. Some of your thoughts might be that they're talking bad about you or they're ignoring you, right? And the way that you may end up feeling is angry, upset, sad, anxious. And your behavior might not be really helpful in order to nourish that friendship in that moment. But one of the things that it's really important to remember is that even if we don't have the power to change the way we feel, we do have control over our thoughts. And if we pay attention to our thoughts, we can change those, or we can at least develop that cognitive flexibility to not see things so automatically in black and white, right? And so one way that we can replace our previous thought would be, you know, those people are talking about something important and they didn't see me, for example. And then my emotions might be more of curiosity or neutral, and my behavior will change, right? So one of the things to deal with our own thoughts is to just pay attention and examine, right? Is this really the right interpretation? Is this helpful? And this is, I'm just sharing for you something that you can keep on a daily basis, where you are paying attention to your feelings. Something happens, so you write down the feeling, you write down the thought, the automatic thoughts, right? And then you examine, are my thoughts accurate? Are these helpful? And how can I replace them with a different way of thinking, right? And then you get back to your feeling again. So there are a lot of practical ways that you can just track your thoughts and think about, again, how helpful this is for me right now. Sometimes, though, it might be really difficult to change our thoughts. Sometimes we might really not be able to change those thoughts, and we believe in the thoughts that we have, and that's okay. And this is where practices, again, like mindfulness come into place. And there was a great research saying that basically, it's not so much about us changing our thoughts or beliefs, but it's about how we relate to those thoughts, right? And there are a lot of mindfulness practices like mindfulness of thoughts, seeing thoughts as clouds in the sky. I allow them to come, to stay, and then I allow them naturally to go. So I don't get caught up into the contents of these thoughts, but I'm just an external observer, right? And for me, this has been really helpful if I cannot really change my thoughts or I don't have the time to stay there and examine. Positive mantras. Again, these might kind of sound really cheesy, but writing down and remembering, and I'm sure that all of you here, if you think about, you do have those positive thoughts that you're telling yourself when you're stressed, right? I can do that. I can overcome obstacles, or I am worthy of happiness, right? I know my worth. Or again, tapping into your belief system, prayer, right? Spirituality. Those are some examples of books that actually encourage positive self-talk. Some of them are from kids, for kids, and one of the developers of trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy was actually the one who really developed the whole program, and I will tell you more about it around those positive thoughts and ways to incorporate self-care into trainings. And the last piece, which is not last, but really important, is a sense of connectedness. And I allowed myself to include a little picture here of my own daughter when she was 6 months old and my stepdaughter, because I thought that this is just a great way to show what is really a sense of attunement and connectedness. And we know from a lot of research that having those positive, safe, and nurturing connection in our life are really important. How can we do this in organizational and work setting? There is something that we call reflective supervision. For those of you here who are in a role of being supervisors or managers, there is a great worksheet on NCTSN. This is the link. But to me, also, when I was in my internships and educational sort of processes, it was really helpful for me to have that supervisor who wouldn't just focus on the technicalities of my work, but who can provide that space that I can process. Why did I feel like this with this particular client? What is going on for me in that moment? And how my own past experience can really impact the way that I am seeing this, or how my own emotions and thoughts can really impact my work. These are some ideas of how can we build that workplace support and connection, really making sure to celebrate the shining moments. Again, those of you who are supervisors, but any one of us, sharing that positive email from a client with the team, just as a reminder that we are really doing important things. Remembering the mission of your organization, of what you are doing, conveying a sense of hope. Some organizations, I heard this recently, wine to wine, when they are going out once a month to drink some wine and just to whine and complain. Any opportunity where you can connect with your peers, with those people that can hold that space and help you to talk through the difficult days or difficult clients. Providing praise can be really fundamental. Sometimes we think that we do a good job in providing praise, but there is a great a lot of work out there in a handout, again, developed by Esther Deblinger, that speaks about specific praise, right? Really making sure that you appreciate your colleagues, you appreciate your clients, thanking them specifically. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for the work that you are doing, right? Being enthusiastic. And then another piece at an organizational level, actually, that we have seen from research is training and use of evidence-based treatments. There is a lot of research out there showing that us being trained in evidence-based treatment can be really helpful. And I will very briefly share actually a research study that I was part of in Ukraine, where we taught more than 130 Ukrainian psychologists in trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And what we have discovered, this is still a very preliminary results under review, was that their levels of compassion satisfaction were really high. And we're talking about people who are living in a country of war. And I will just share a quote of one of our participants who sat through our training. It is a 1-year-long training, and she was saying, you know, when you are in the midst of a war, you're more resilient, actually. At the beginning of the war, I was intentionally finding ways to help. It was important to have this sense of belonging, and it definitely gives you a wings that you are able to help people. And trainings like this is exactly what helps us. So again, the power of training, the power of helping people. And sometimes when we are in the midst of the most difficult moments and situations, helping others can be really powerful. And this brings me to the closure that really self-care is relational care, right? And the best way to help yourself sometimes, it's not just to go and do things in isolation, but to help others, right? Or allow others to help us as well. Remembering your whys, right? Maybe a reflective exercise that you can do later is to remember and remind yourself of why you started doing this work, what is really meaningful for you, and who are your affiliates, right? Who are the family members, the friends, the colleagues, the mentors that you can access and that can help you to process the difficult cases or all the stress that it's worth it for you to examine and take care of you. And last, actually, I was very pleased when I saw in the chat at the very beginning of our time together today, I think one of the biggest questions, and I don't know if I have the answer, but maybe many of you do, is how can we turn difficult experiences and stressful periods in our life from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth, right? How can we allow ourselves and build that sense of psychological safety and supportive relationships around us that can help us to make meaning of the things that are happening, so that we can reestablish our priorities, understand what really matters to us, who are the people that we can help, that we appreciate, and how can we discover our own resiliency? And I know this is a big question, but I thought that it's worth it to mention the beauty of the growth that we can find even in the midst of the most difficult situations and adversities. So in terms of takeaway, again, secondary traumatic stress and burnout is not an abnormal condition. It's a normal reaction to a stressful environment. We've learned that there is a new response to trauma and stress, which is the affiliate response, which is a very effective one. And we've also learned that self-awareness, regulation, and connectedness can be really important for our own personal growth and resiliency. Thank you so much for all of you here. We have a lot of resources that we want to share. These are some of my contact information, and I know I took 10 minutes longer out of our question sessions, but I know we have 6 minutes left, and I'll be happy to stay longer for those of you who have more questions.
I think we were all so enthralled with what you're saying. Nobody's noticed the time. I hope you can see the reactions, Latina. It is, I think This is one of the most timely and well-needed sessions that we've ever had. I appreciate the honesty and the participation by everyone who's joined us online. And everything you shared, I just think that there were so many helpful tips that I hope that, you can make an impact with what you shared today. I know for me, have circled so many things on your slides and I think reminding us all why we do what we do is important and that it's okay to feel this way and it's okay to struggle because, the job is hard. Job is hard. It is difficult. It's emotional. It's draining, but it's so desperately needed that we have to have self-care because if this level of professional burns out, it's the children who suffer, so I think everyone embraces what you have to say, and so thank you.
Thank you, Jane, so much. And I think that we are modeling in a way the importance also of those relationships, because I think people can feel, right, the synergy and the beliefs that we share together. And I think that this is also something really important. And I appreciate so much all these amazing feedback and reactions. And it's really an incredible privilege to be here. I know that we threw a lot of information out there, and each of those concepts can be taken and practiced. So I hope that we'll continue this conversation, which I agree it's really needed, and do more of these webinars and get even more into the practicalities of some of the strategies.
And I do want to reiterate, I know I was putting fast and furious links in the chat, which is sometimes a difficult way for people to access the resources. So on the page that will house the recording, everyone will get a follow-up email, but on that page, on the right-hand side, the resources are listed. If there are any that aren't there, you will also have a copy of Latina's slide deck accessible from that page. So you can copy and paste the links that she shared on the particular slides. As well from that. So hopefully there's nothing that will get missed, between all three of those avenues of accessing it. The recording takes me a few hours to get up. I upload it to YouTube, so it will be on that page as well. So that page will be one-stop shopping for any thing that people may want to access from today. And then there were some questions. Satina, I hope you have time to maybe hit a couple of them, and some of them may have been answered later. But it said, looking at reasons for burnout that you listed, would you view the risks of frontline workers who are paraprofessionals working in their own communities all over the world in under-resourced areas? Seems that they would be highly at risk and don't have support in place.
This is such a beautiful question, and I'm so grateful for the person who brought up this about paraprofessionals, because this is definitely where the field is going. In our center, we are incorporating an incredible amount of people with lived experience, actually, to co-train with us, to provide parenting groups. We work with a lot of children and families suffering trauma. And I think that one of the most sort of meaningful things that we're incorporating, that I believe it's been very helpful for people with lived experience and paraprofessionals, peer support, we call them in a very different terms. It's really to give them the opportunity to be appreciated, to be valued, to be paid for their services, if we can really do that, but really to bring them at an equal level of us professionals. Again, we're doing a lot of groups for parents who are involved in the child welfare system, and I am teaching together with a parent who is a peer professional with lived experience and who is co-teaching together with me. And I think that I know from the personal feedback and focus groups that we had to run with these people is that actually that's their way that they feel like they can give back, by feeling that they're equally treated and involved in this work, so that they can give back. But this is a great question. And I just think that this role of people with lived experience, it's so fundamental, right? And we can't really do this work without the real voices. And sometimes kids and families relate much more to someone with lived experience than someone like me, for example, who is a clinician.
Absolutely. There's a question about studies. I know that, we love our data-based programs, right? And so it says any of the studies shared about protective factors, were they based on the majority of the world versus the global north? How are the study, I guess, even a broader question is when studies are done, in the global north versus, other parts of the world, are the findings different? Are the protective factors different? Are the tools and resources adapted accordingly?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think I should go back in the literature and pay more attention where exactly the studies have been done. I think that a lot of studies are trying to incorporate representative samples. For example, those studies that I cited about the personal factors, the fact that sometimes white professionals can suffer more burnout and secondary traumatic stress, and how people from other cultures and other countries where there is more of a community-based type of culture might have more access to social support. And so over there, burnout or secondary traumatic stress may look really different. But this is a great question to sort of pay more attention and look at those factors for sure.
And I believe you tackled this question, but I just want to make sure the connection between depersonalization and disassociation. I think that may have been in the chat as well.
I think that depersonalization is a form of dissociation, because dissociation can take different forms. Sometimes I had, for example, a client of mine, a 16-year-old girl, who would come to sessions and she would kind of get really sleepy and sort of really kind of not present. And I think that that was her own way of avoiding, right, or dissociating in a way. So I think depersonalization is more this sense of your mind is leaving your body and you feel like you're just not part of the world, almost like you're observing things, but from an external perspective. Whereas dissociation sometimes can really take forms of completely losing even a sense of consciousness. And dissociation is usually triggered by something that it's more trauma related. And we see this in more complex kind of cases. But really, depersonalization can be also a form of dissociation. So they might be very similar, actually.
Interesting. And there's a question from Mark about the evidence from Tanya Singer and others that constant empathy causes fatigue, but less so compassion or sympathy. Could you clarify the distinction here and how it relates to secondary trauma?
That is such a great question, Mark. And if Mark is online, I would love for him to unpack a little bit more about this, because that's definitely what we were talking about, sort of compassion fatigue, right? How when we are really burnt out, we may not be able to sort of empathize with a lot of people. But compassion or sympathy, there is actually a great video of Brené Brown that talks about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Maybe I can put it in the chat real quick at the end, but I think that there is a difference between those two things. And one of the things that I've heard from a colleague lately was that those people that are more able to be compassionate are those that have better boundaries, which I found really interesting. But that's a great question as well. And we'll make sure to put the little video in the chat, which is a great way to think of those two.
Oh, perfect. I can put that on the website page too, Zatina.
Yes, sure.
So you referenced quite a few assessment tools. So how would you advocate those being used by some of our audience members? It looked like some of them were assessments of the workplace or could be used as such if you're a supervisor. Some are personal assessments. I mean, how do you see our audience using those?
I think it really depends on the organization and the personal choice. I would really pay closer attention to the assessments that I'm more familiar with, which are the ProQual, and this is an assessment that we have used in our Ukrainian research study and in many other studies. and also the organizational assessment from the University of Kentucky. Those are validated measures and very easy to take. Now, if it is for a single individual, the ProQual, again, could be just taken at home for you to look at those results. And I think that it's important to reflect on what are the questions that are sort of standing up for you. And if you are definitely in a higher score of compassion fatigue or burnout or secondary traumatic stress, to make sure you talk to your supervisors, right? And talk to people to sort of share those results in the same way that we in psychotherapy, if we administer a questionnaire on a client and they're in a clinical level, we'll make sure to talk to them and have a way to address them. The organizational assessment, I think it's worth it for managers and people at a leadership position to look at. But again, those can be administered during supervision time, and they could be incorporated during trainings, for example, on secondary traumatic stress. And sort of kind of give you the picture of where your team is and what can be needed, but really looking at the specific symptoms in a way, and how can you create an individualized strategy, both at an individual and organizational level, can be really important, I think, and addressed at those multiple levels.
Perfect. Thank you. There were a couple comments about social stigma. So how would you advocate when potentially society or our own, in our own personal relationships, others don't find value in what we do, and that in itself makes us devalue sometimes ourself, in our profession, or makes our trauma higher because we're not feeling, you talked about connectivity and surrounding yourself with people who are positive and supportive, but I think it felt like in the chat, some people felt like there was really kind of a social stigma of not society or communities at large not valuing the work that's being done by child protection professionals, and how that can impact how we feel about our roles and our jobs.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a great question. And it so much depends on the communities and countries that we're living. I think that some countries have a now better understanding about the importance of mental health, the importance of childhood trauma, but others may not. And there might be not even a good communication and collaboration between different agencies, right, at a multi-agency level. And definitely, I think this goes back a little bit into the moral distress as well. When we know what is the best thing and why we're doing what we're doing, but the society that we are in may not place that same importance. And I think this is something, I'm not sure again if we have an easy answer to this, but being aware of it and seeing at your level, how can you increase more the awareness about trauma, for example, even using the research, the data that we know how trauma can impact physical and mental health of children, right? And children are our future, and how much more money actually we will be spending as an entire country treating people with severe mental health diagnosis later in life instead of working on prevention, right? Thinking about how can we pass those, even that information in whatever level, so that we can again advocate for what we are doing and the importance of what we are doing. But this can definitely be impactful for us as well. And I think that the reason why global organizations like ISCAN can give us the opportunity to create those networks even outside of our countries or counties or states, with people that are appreciative and value our work, and how can we collaborate together to fight against social stigma and all this.
Thank you. And then there was I believe that from the chat, you could tell mindfulness struck a chord with a lot of people. And the question is just, how is mindfulness different from other cognitive strategies?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll be very happy to come back and dive a little bit deeper into the mindfulness piece. I think the biggest difference between mindfulness and other cognitive strategies is that mindfulness doesn't look necessarily to change our thoughts, right? It doesn't look to necessarily analyze the contents of the thoughts and change them, which might be difficult, but mindfulness provides us a different way to relate to our thoughts so that I can be aware of my thoughts, of my unhelpful, particularly, or negative patterns of my mind. But instead of me being taken away from these thoughts and then find myself feeling really anxious or upset or depressed, I can notice them and simply observe my thoughts, right? And get back to my awareness of my body, of what am I doing now, without being caught up into those thoughts. And again, research is showing that sometimes this approach is more helpful because it's more difficult for people to really change, particularly those deeper thoughts that we hold and beliefs, but we can change the way that we relate to them. And mindfulness provides you this tool in a very simple way that can be used every day.
Thank you. And we're going to take one last question, and I'm going to be protective of your time. But the question is, does a wounded healer require additional attention to their mental health compared to individuals who have not endured trauma in order to fulfill their role as child care carers effectively?
Yes, I'm reading this question. A wounded healer require additional attention to their mental health compared to individuals who have not endured trauma in order to fulfill their role as child care effectively. I'm not sure if I understand the wounded. Oh, okay. Yes. Of course. Sorry. I was getting too much caught up in my own thoughts here. See? I do think that it was in one of the slides, and research is saying that if we as healers, as professionals, have our own history of trauma and mental health, that can make us more vulnerable, right, to burnout and secondary traumatic stress because we might be more easily triggered. So I think that paying attention to that and even increasing more our self-care can be really important. And at the same time, knowing that we have a superpower as well, because we have maybe that same history of trauma that can really help us to relate to those clients in a way that we really understand. But really creating those healthy boundaries so that you are processed already your own trauma in a way that you're detached enough to be able to help others. So it's a great question and complex question.
I love how you phrase it as a superpower. You know, talking about taking really tragic trauma and turning it into, a really powerful force for change. And so that was a beautiful way to put that. So thank you. Excuse me. So Zatina, I don't even know what to say. I'm speechless. It was such an incredible session. The positivity that you continue to exude, talking about a really difficult subject. I mean, I feel like talking to you is like drinking a warm cup of coffee, and I feel like I just had a 90-minute therapy session, and so I feel like our audience feels that as well. I mean, I will send you the chat because I think you really need to see what an impact you've had today. And for our audience, you've been amazing. Thank you for participating. We probably had over 500 messages in the chat, and here we are, well past our time with still 200 people online. So again, thank you to the audience as well. We appreciate everything you do. You are invaluable, in the fight for children. And again, I can't thank our audience members enough as well. Both, you're being here and you're staying, and your contribution was amazing. And I see some things popping up in chat. Please know the recording will be out this afternoon, the link to the pages, all the resources. It should all be there for you. And if not, please just feel free to contact me. And between Zatina and I will make sure we get you everything that you want from today's session. So again, warmest regards to everyone. Zatina, you're amazing. So thank you.
Thank you. And please allow me to thank everybody here. I see still so many participants staying after time, and for the work that you are doing and putting yourself out there through the chat. I felt the energy of people and all these beautiful hearts, which I think it's really a great way to think about the power of connection. And I cannot thank enough ISCAN, all the people in ISCAN, and you, Jane, today for being here with me today, because you are an incredible support and enhancing so powerfully my voice, the voice of everyone here, and making us all feel at home. So really thank you to you and everybody behind the scenes who worked for this webinar, and all of you doing this amazing job. So thank you. And good night for Indonesia and anyone who is on the other side of the globe.
Oh. And Holly, thank you as always for being here and for engaging us in the chat. Your support is invaluable. So thank you, Holly. All right. Well, good day, good night,
Thank you.
good evening to everyone. And again, I hope we all are one step closer to getting some calm back in our life and some positivity back in our lives. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Bye.